All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Still plenty of seats over here if you're coming in. If we haven't had a chance to meet, I'm Kane Osborne. I'm the superintendent here in District 95. Miss Allen, principal of Spencer Loomis, is back there, and Miss Soroka's here. Mr. Jackowitz from Middle School North had a death in his family. He had to attend a funeral out of town, so Miss Soroka's here. And Doug Goldberg, our board president's here. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So I appreciate you coming out, especially on a playoff night. I won't say I'm going to rush through this so you can get home, but I don't want to also take too much of your time if you want to get home. But the goal is not about that, of course. The objectives for tonight, for coming to this presentation, really largely to share with you and build an understanding of the current state of the capacity here at Loomis and North, the challenges to learning space capacity in the near term here at Loomis and at North, and understanding the decision to implement temporary modular classrooms beginning in 1920. Yes, they can also be called mobiles, but I'll talk a little bit about why we're calling them modulars after we've actually had staff go and look at some of these buildings. And then to get critical questions and feedback from you regarding the implementation. Tonight's really just the start. We're going to talk about another date that we're setting for having you come in and getting butcher paper out and getting brainstorming about questions and things that you have around implementing going forward. So this would not be the full goal for that purpose tonight, just partially. When we get together later, that would be the only purpose for us getting together, is to pick your brains on that in a lot more detail. So the current state, our secondary enrollment here in the district does continue to decline. We've known that. You can see it as a wave when you look at enrollment numbers, and it's expected for the next few years. Elementary enrollment is up 5.5% in 3 years. That's even including a slight drop this year. And Spencer Loomis is up over 14% in 3 years, including just about 3% drop this year. But we have reasons to think the elementary enrollment increase is going to continue. This is just, it's kind of fuzzy. The whole point of showing this is Spencer Loomis's enrollment. Now these are numbers we report to the state, so they come out a little differently. But these are the other schools, and you can see that Loomis has had the most dramatic enrollment increase. And some of our other schools have had increases and some have drops. In the near term, related to this, we know obviously there's more housing coming in right across the street. I think over 60 units total is planned for that development coming in, and other things that are related to the near term. We'll talk about what we've done so far, but there's not really additional learning space available at North. Not very much more really for classroom space. We'll talk about what we have done in that regard. And we do know that there's even more housing coming online in the Spencer Loomis boundary area and other District 95 boundary areas. We've met with the village managers of all the villages that feed into the district, gotten some preliminary numbers of what's being approved over the next 2 years, and there's a lot more housing coming online. Class sizes here at Loomis have generally stayed within the guidelines. I'll show you a little bit more data on that. The Spencer Loomis sizes have been in the upper range of those guidelines for the last 5 years. The measures we've taken non-instructional space, converted it into instructional space for students to use with teachers. We've moved instruction from Loomis over to North, as many of you know. We've converted classroom porches, which are the areas that connect some classrooms, into other uses to create more space. And we've increased storageway in the hallways to accommodate some higher class sizes. Again, they're within the guidelines, but what I'm going to show you here are 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade for the last 5 years. And these are all the other schools in the district, and this is Spencer Loomis. Now, as you can see, they all go up and down from year to year a little bit, but the point of these is to illustrate that in each case, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, even with a dip, and 5th grade, Spencer Loomis is consistently at the upper range every year, okay? We're within the guidelines, but the concern is when we look at the other factors, there's a limit to what you can do. without breaking through the guidelines and having 30 students in a classroom potentially. And we think based on the other things that we've done, we're very close to that limit. So the long-term solution, as many of you know, is twofold. One is from passing the referendum, we're putting air conditioning in all our buildings, we're updating all of our libraries, and we're building a new May Whitney Elementary School. Also in our strategic plan, which we had talked about doing this year, but we've decided to defer because of these things largely, is a community engagement process for looking at the boundaries in the district so that we can balance this out over time. So that's the long-term plan. These things won't be done overnight, okay? This will open up in the fall of 2021. Some of the schools will get air conditioning sooner, but really the construction plan doesn't have all of these things finished for at least 4 years. So the interim solution until the buildings are up to date and until the housing picture is a little clearer in terms of what's actually going to start going up and how fast is temporary modular classrooms here at Loomis and north in the courtyard. These would be 4 classrooms that share a hallway. Okay, so they kind of function as one unit that we would think of them. They're really kind of 4 units, and in a weird way they're 8 units, but they're really 4 classrooms around a single hallway, but they exist as one structure. They would be in the courtyard. The courtyard would be fenced in by an 8-foot high fence and secured. And we would have an ADA accessible pathway from the building to the entryway to these classrooms. And the last piece is the one to know. I think I mentioned it in the letter. There would be a 3-year shelf life. We don't know that we'd even need it in the 3rd year, because in the 3rd year would be when we would start to implement boundary changes after going through community engagement. But we keep it for a 3rd year because we haven't decided how we're going to do that yet. If we needed space for 1 extra year, we would have it. We wouldn't necessarily use it. The other thing to know about that is there's a process that this will go through with the Village of Hawthorne Woods. That process hasn't approved it yet, but in preliminary conversations, they've been very clear. You know, the Village of Hawthorne Woods doesn't have outbuildings. The reason we're going through this process with them is because they have to approve through special use this building, and they've said we don't feel comfortable approving it for more than 3 years. Frankly, I'm fine with that. I'm not only fine with it, it's good. It keeps me accountable to this plan that I've discussed and the strategic plan that we've discussed before.
Can I ask a quick question? So is the idea to change boundaries rather than add on to this school?
Correct. We will have capacity at other buildings, but before we start talking to families about where you're going to move, we'd rather say you're going to move to a building that has air conditioning, that has all the other things we've been implementing through the referendum in all the buildings, as opposed to saying we're going to move you into a building that doesn't have those things and might be next to a construction site potentially, or just not finished yet.
And at what school year are you talking about the boundaries taking effect?
We would look at the fall of 21. Okay? So 19 and 20, 2021, we'd have the modulars, and in that 2nd year, we'd be doing the community engagement process to talk about the boundaries, and then we'd implement them for the fall. So the fall of 2021, it gets confusing with all the 20s, but the fall of 2021 would be when we would, 1, have new boundaries, and 2, intend to not be using the modulars. As I said, though, we would keep them for 1 extra year because there's a lot of different ways you can do boundaries. You can do them as a phase-in, you can do them as a hard start, and because we haven't gotten to that process, I don't want to pull away the modulars and then find out, well, we're going to do a phase-in and we might need them for a year.
The 4 classrooms you mentioned, are you going to go through what you're thinking, whether that's real academics or is it like the specials?
Not going to get to that part yet, but I'm going to talk about some things related to that. When we meet in December, let me talk about it, but the answer is no, but there's a reason for that. So characteristics of these, and this has changed since Vicki Cullinan, my chief business officer, and Lyle Erstad, the facilities director, went and visited the producer of these innovative modular solutions. and we've updated it. Some things that are a little bit counter to even what I knew before is that, one, the buildings we're talking about are made with all the same materials you would make a fixed building, basically, with the exception in this case of brick, but that's a choice. The same design and materials can be used for temporary or permanent solutions. This company often builds permanent solutions that look almost identical to what you would think are temporary solutions. And it's not a mobile or a trailer in a typical sense, meaning we often think like construction site trailer, you know, pretty flimsy, you know, out there in the middle of nowhere, looking like it's about to be blown over. I can tell you that's not this structure. So other characteristics that are specific to, you know, Spencer Loomis Middle School North, I ran out of room here, but that are specific to implementing them here are courtyard fenced in, okay? So a lot of districts, if you go to District 220, for instance, where they have them at least 4 schools that I know of, they're not fenced in, they're not secured in any way. Here they would be secured, and it would be a large secured gate also. The only access to the courtyards where they would be through the building, okay? So you would have to already come into the building in order to get to these. And then two-way, we'd have two-way wired communication. In other words, they'd be in regular contact just like any classroom would be in contact with the main office or with the whole building.
Do the kids and the teachers have to walk outside to get into them, or is there a way to connect
We're
them?
going to talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So.
And is it a solid fence, I would assume? The fence is actually a solid piece as opposed to something that has, you know, holes and chain link or something like that?
It's a cyclone fence. It's 8 feet high, so it looks like a chain link fence.
So somebody could put something through it, shoot something through it?
Uh-huh. So certainly we have other site issues at any school regarding that right now. We're going to get to questions. I have a whole slide that just say questions. So this is a sample. This is just what a sample one of these buildings could look like. Heating and ventilation units, windows. It's like a vinyl siding building, and you can see the entrance and the exit. I'm sorry. Again, that's a sample of what one of these could look like.
Do you know what kind of foundation they sit on? You said they're like not like a trailer.
We have a choice. We have to determine whether or not we're going to put it on basically cement piers.
Okay.
Okay. This is just the site. I think you all know this already. But here is where the fence would be, flush to the building, and here is where the modulars would be. Previously, discussions were, you know, if you look at the site, you know, to your point about access, any school site, unless it's fenced off, you know, far away and the whole property is fenced off, you have challenges with security, certainly. The other place that was viable and close to the building was here. We didn't feel that that was a good option ultimately for other reasons related to access, related to the buses, related to driving up to them, and related to eliminating elementary playground space. This is just a schematic of what it would look like. You can see the hallway in between the classrooms. And just for visual, because I can't tell how well you can see, you know, these are the lines around the classrooms. So these would be the 4 classrooms, and then you would have entrance and exit that would be secured on either end. So just the advantages to this overall is in the time that between this and when we would do boundary review, we would have a simpler boundary review process and a clearer picture of how to do it, especially because we'd be talking about wherever we sent kids, they'd be similar facilities. We wouldn't be talking about temporarily sending them to some place that didn't have air conditioning or didn't have the same facilities in place. Less disruption, especially in regards to the May Whitney site, which will be under construction. And then it would meet the potential need for, and I put potential, need for more smaller sections. In other words, that issue with every section, every grade being closer to the limit, based on what we're seeing with population, right now we have nowhere to add another section. So if another section needs to open, we would have a way to open those other sections. We could also look at returning kind of some balance to the use of the buildings, right? We have students going over there. We have students in not, quote unquote, not ideal instructional spaces. We could reconsider that depending on the situation. And we'd be able to do that for the duration of this period.
Are you seeing the 4 units as a limit in the capacity? Or are you seeing after year 1 you may add another 2?
We don't see the projections requiring adding. No, we have no plans to add. Based on what we think that should be sufficient for the interim period until we're ready to have schools to send students to appropriately after going through that community engagement process. So you had asked about what would we put in the mobiles. We're not at the stage where we've made any decisions about what we would put in these classrooms. We believe that we have to look clearly at what are the criteria we need to consider to then make a decision about putting which students to put in, which is the best group of students to put in modular classrooms. We have what I'm calling initial criteria, but as I'll talk about, our goal is to have a meeting in December with staff and with you, with any parents who will come, to kind of start talking about, okay, here are initial criteria. What questions do you have about what that means in your child's day? What are your concerns and questions? And then what are criteria that we might not be thinking of? Okay, and then I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next steps. So we did meet with the staff on September 17th. They had very good, very typical questions, much like the one that you had, and the answer is the same. When we sit down and start brainstorming and going over what are the criteria you'd use to decide who would be best suited to be in those rooms, we need everybody's input in that part of the process.
What's the downstream decision process on those criteria and what actually gets accepted?
I'm going to talk about that in just a sec. Thank you. So after tonight, you have question cards, and we're hoping that one, you'll generate questions. We'll talk about some of them tonight, but a lot of them will produce into FAQs, and then a lot of them will go downstream to this part of the process too, as we imagine they should. After the FAQs, we will go to a village hearing process in October and November just to get the use permit approved. Like I said, every conversation we've had with the village, I'm not going to change this request, is about a 3-year use. So they're not expecting it for longer than that. We're not asking for it for longer than that.
And they've approved the 3-year use?
No, we're going to them in October and November. They have
We don't have an approval from them at this point.
No, we've talked to them about it. We've notified them of it. So that's a good question. We didn't feel that we could just go get it approved and then notify you and have you see on a board agenda somewhere that we were doing this without notifying you and talking to you at least about it.
What's plan B if they don't approve it?
Well, we'll talk to them about that. Plan B, we'd have to look at any number of things, but we'd have to figure out what we would do if we have larger class sizes. We don't have necessarily an answer right now. That's why we are where we are. So we'd have to go back and basically brainstorm on a different set of things. So we'll give updates to the board based on FAQs, based on talking to the village in November and December. And then at the same time, in early December, we would have staff, parent, and even student feedback sessions. So we'd have an evening like tonight where we would go through what we see as the general criteria for implementation. But again, ask you, what does that mean for what questions do you have about how your student goes through the day? And it would really start with these, but we anticipate that there would be, more than that. We just don't feel that we want to get so far down the road and dictate all those things without first going through a brainstorming session with you and the staff particularly. So the board would look to approve the leases in November and December. Depending on the timeline, that can get moved back. Then once we've done this, we would look between this time and the spring to finalize security and operational protocols and update you on those things. That would be in this interim period when we would decide, okay, here are the criteria that we're going to use. We would look at the options then of who could be scheduled into those modulars and make a decision based on matching what the options are with the criteria.
And then how does that decision actually get made? Who makes the decision?
I make it with the principals. And so we would notify, so families, the entire community would walk out before school ended knowing those things. And then we would install them in the late spring, really early summer, and ROE inspection would happen once they're installed. Is that correct, Mr. Erstin? So that's the basic timeline for this process. Now it's questions. So what I would say is do make sure that you write down your questions too. Also, and if you write them down now and pass them forward, we can read them all. We are recording this, okay? This will be posted to the website, and we will notify the entire Spencer Loomis and Middle School North community that it is posted and that they should view it. And then, of course, we anticipate more questions from people who are not able to attend. The questions we gather tonight we'll use in December, obviously, but we would hope you would also come in December, too. So.
Can you submit questions between now and then? Because
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. So when we, probably the good time would be when we issue these, we'll put a link on there or like a feedback email where you can then shoot more. When in doing processes like these, what we see is FAQs change, right? We issue based on the questions we've had, and then we get more questions, and we issue updated FAQs. We would use this very much, as part of this process too. Okay, so I'm going to start left and go right. Yes.
Currently, how many classrooms are being used at Spencer Loomis because we have air conditioning? That those children aren't necessarily in our boundary, but are here because we have air conditioning?
Those would all be students with IEPs.
I understand.
Dr. Coleman's not here, or Ms. Allen, 3.
We have 3
classrooms. One is a reduced size classroom, it's not as large as the others, on the second floor. The other are actually 2 smaller classrooms that were originally meant for like small instructional breakout rooms. So it's not a full-size classroom that's being utilized for second class.
Okay, and then which is the next school to get air conditioning and in what year?
Isaac Fox and Middle School North. South, of course. We'll get them next summer.
So potentially some of these students could possibly go back to their own boundary school?
It
Freeing
doesn't
up
work that
space
way
here.
because when they're in self-contained programs, we don't necessarily have these are district-wide programs, so we don't have one in every school because otherwise you can't allocate your resources. So it would be, in other words, you would move the whole program.
Right, but if
to another
Fox
school.
maybe has more space than we do.
We could consider that. One of the challenges is we'd like to do the boundaries once and move once, because I'll just tell you, I don't think it's right or fair over time if you look to bounce programs around. Like if I'm going to say, well, I'm going to move the special ed kids, and then I'm going to redo boundaries, and then I'm going to have to move them again, right? I've been places where that's happened. It's happened to a degree here in the past, and that's simply not fair. So we would have to look and see where the boundaries are. Yes.
And I might have missed it, there's a lot of talk of the Spencer Loomis class size being larger, and that's the big concern with looking at the enrollment over the next few years. I'm just concerned, like, are we gonna run into this again in the middle school? Like, are those classes also at capacity? And so is it just gonna keep getting a bigger problem? If we're not gonna keep these outbuildings, and we still only have 2 middle schools, and we're gonna get all of these elementary school kids coming in, they're going to grow up and go into middle school, right? So are we forward thinking about the middle school class sizes as well?
So 2 things. One, middle school doesn't typically have the same issues, same reason high school doesn't.
Okay.
So you might see some bubbles, but because the way you schedule middle school, it's not the same problem.
Okay.
But 2, when we redo boundaries, it's not just necessarily we'll look at all the schools.
Sure.
So we would look at secondary schools too. So we would take that into consideration, to balance it out. We wouldn't just do it at the elementaries and then see the same bulge collectively move up at just one school when we could redistribute it appropriately.
So you're saying that, just so I understand, that we would distribute, we have enough space in the 2 middle schools that we have in the district to accommodate all of the kids, plus the kids that are coming into the district?
We believe so, yes. I've seen no numbers that make me think that's not the case. I'm sorry, the question was, have we considered the is there a problem population-wise and enrollment and class size-wise at the middle school that could roll upstream that we'll just be dealing with that in some version like this? Based on what we know about middle school scheduling, our capacity, and our enrollment numbers, our belief is no. I want to make sure I heard it, sorry, because I keep kind of turning towards the person who asked. So. Okay.
Are there bathrooms in the modular?
There are not bathrooms in the modular.
So those students would have to walk in or be walked in?
Yes, they would walk into the building, basically right there to go to the restroom.
I have 2 questions that, one relates to, are the mobile classrooms going to be enclosed anyway, or will the children have to put their coats on and go outside to get to the main building?
Well, they'll go outside in the sense that they'll go through the courtyard. They won't go.
So it will be outdoor, not
Yeah.
enclosed?
Correct, yes. It'll be about 30 feet that way or 40 feet that way, which is typically what you see at the large majority of places that have mobiles. I've been placed for one where it's like 10 feet. They put an enclosure over it, which is a little crazy. I just talked to Brian Harris in Barrington, the superintendent there, where they've just put in 8 at Grove Elementary. Same thing. They didn't put an enclosure. They took a different tack. But as of right now, we're not planning to put an enclosure in. I'm sorry, you said you had 2. You said you did say you had 2.
You said you've gone and looked at the mobile classrooms. So does that mean you know?
My CFO and my buildings director have, yes.
Oh, so does that mean you know who's manufacturing the home?
Yeah, we know who we'd be working with. Yep, Innovative Modular Solutions.
The manufacturer of the modular classroom is Whitley.
Is Whitley. And then the kind of the vendor, the person who does it, is Innovative Modular.
And it's Whitley with L-E-Y?
Whitley, I think it's W-H-I-T-L-E-Y.
Okay, and
I
it's
believe
Innovative
that's the name.
Modular Solutions. Thank you.
Correct. Yes.
This is just an extension of Lisa's question, that's what I was thinking about, from the middle school standpoint, because your title says Spencer Lewis and Middle School North, but it sounds like this is really directly affecting Spencer Lewis, correct?
It is right now, yes. So that's a good question. So it seems like it all points to a Spencer Loomis solution. We don't know that it will because we have to draft criteria and look. Both Mr. Jackowitz and Ms. Allen will be looking at what solutions from either one, because one of the options is, if we have a middle school solution, then space gets vacated in the middle school that we would move overflow from Loomis over there, right? So we just have to, again, look at the criteria we draft and see which works better. You have things like, accessibility. The big one with accessibility is you have to talk about lots of people moving out a lot, right? Or fewer people moving less. And we have to look at scheduling and see how is that going to work best.
And then just an extension of that, so would you, like the 4 modular classrooms would be mostly either all Spencer Loomis or middle school North? It wouldn't be a combination of like 8th graders and 2nd graders or
well, one, I don't have an answer. I want to be clear, I don't have an answer, but I would find that one very unlikely, right? But, I mean, where'd Sandy go? Oh, but yeah, we would all be in a room talking about that, and that wouldn't happen until after, we draft criteria that you would be a part of. We would show you those criteria after we were done, and then say, now we're going to go draft potential schedules or ways to have kids in there and see which one we think matches up best with those criteria. So that's why I don't have a specific answer. I have to admit, I find it hard to believe we would put 8th graders and 2nd graders there, but we haven't thought about that specifically yet.
How many kids are you projecting that this would accommodate?
I mean, we would typically look at, it's a standard classroom size, so we say 25, so it'd be 100 kids, potentially.
Does that also impact staffing and other facilities, operations, like some of the specials or lunch programs?
We think that these numbers will be okay. you know, that is an issue. If we were going to start adding, you know, 300 kids long-term to this school, that would be a real serious issue. You'd have to talk about art, music, other specials, lunch, gym, things like that. We think for an interim solution for the numbers we're talking about, that won't be an issue. The other thing I want to say is those are for standard classrooms that, you know, you kind of say 25 as a rule of thumb. But we also, you know, one of the things we have to look at is really what are we making available, right? If I have some classrooms that have less than 25 in them on average for whatever reason, and I can move enough of those out there to vacate 4 classrooms in the building, you know. So it's really about looking at both of those things. It's not necessarily looking at, you know, what am I moving there, but what am I making possible by adopting certain criteria and scheduling kids in there. So we would look at lots of permutations.
Can you comment a little bit about the new May Whitney? Are any of those students going to be moved over? Like, how's the construction within the process going to work, and is the school going to be bigger?
The school is going to be bigger.
Okay.
We did, if you remember back to community engagement, we looked at creating a school that had more usable space than the current school does. The school has a lot of space over there, but it's not all very usable. So we anticipate what we call a 5-section building, which is bigger than what they have now. And that would enable us, when we look at boundaries, to look at how, you know, where's the appropriate place. So we wouldn't anticipate May Whitney students currently boundaried to come here. Is that part of your question?
No.
Okay.
How's the construction
Oh,
going to
construction.
work? Like, is it going to be a building next to the existing building?
It's going to be a building next to the existing building. So the whole goal, and we're going through some of these meetings right now, is that site will be built while the students are going to May Whitney. I'm not going to lie to you, that's not ideal, right? So we have to do a lot of planning and communication. But when you think about what the options are, you know, it's not very easy either. There's a lot of careful planning that goes into place, but the idea is that building gets built, those students basically move in, and as they do that, the year before that happens is when we would go through community engagement on boundaries, so that when they're moving in the fall of 21, any students that would be boundaried in would go in. That relieves any pressure that's here, and it's a new building. So, okay.
So, because we're talking about the boundary, if in that year 21, I have a 5th grade student, would they be grandfathered in to stay?
Not there yet.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I understand your question, but I would be, there's 1,000 ways to do boundaries. We will absolutely talk about those things when we do community engagement, kind of like we did when I was here my first year for strategic planning, and then last year for the referendum. We'll be going through a process where we present information, ask for feedback, ask critical questions, and then we come up with what we think is a recommendation. I've been in places where they've grandfathered. I've been in places where they haven't grandfathered. You know, so I just don't want to lie to you and say,
No, that's
yeah.
fine.
When we're talking about capacity issues in the district, are there other schools where there are overcapacity issues, or is it just Spencer Loomis? And on the flip side, is May Whitney going to be the only building with capacity, or will there potentially be other schools with capacity? And the question I'm getting at, which I'm sure everybody understands, is it really that some Spencer Loomis kids will probably be going to May Whitney, or is it that we're looking to redraw the map for the whole district?
We will actually look to redraw the map for the whole district. Some buildings, it's varying in terms of how much quote-unquote slack or capacity there is.
Yep.
Some buildings are closer to their edge, some are farther away. I would not say anybody's like vastly underdone, but when you just look at the balance and what we think is, we don't think the population here is going to like go through the roof. We're a pretty built-out community, but we think there's going to be enough growth that we have to, and we think we have the slack to meet that based on the things that we're doing.
How far out are we looking? Because the community, obviously, as this generation ages, then we're going to have capacity in 5, 10 years in all of the schools again. So how far out are you anticipating that the redistricting will work?
Oh, we would just, I don't have that kind of crystal ball. And
yeah.
Redistricting is usually permanent.
I'm sorry, redrawing the boundary.
That's usually, I want to say permanent, in the sense of you don't go and then undo it.
Right.
You revisit it to see if your enrollment patterns have continued to work well, or if you need to redistrict again, redraw the boundaries again. You go through a process for that. I will tell you, some districts do this like every 2 years.
Right.
It's not my intention to do that.
So, Kane, if I can weigh in, we last redistricted about 10 years ago when we closed the school across town. That was Charles Button. That was due, obviously, to the fact that we're losing building. So we obviously had to find places to put those kids. And just let me talk for a few moments about capacity. If you look back 10 plus years, we had almost 1,000 more students in our district than we have now. Now, keep in mind that was with one additional elementary school, which holds nominally 500-ish kids. So there's absolutely capacity in the district for it. It's a question, as Kane was saying, where's the right place to go? And the process of determining, what the right boundary should be is complicated and obviously emotional on top of that. I mean, I can tell you, my kids were redistricted to a different building, obviously, because I went to Quentin and I lived through all that. But clearly, our purpose here is to try to get information out as early as possible. We're very anxious to hear comments, obviously, from everybody about how their feelings are. We take them very seriously. I also want to thank everybody that voted for the referendum for that. That's a huge deal for us because we now have the resource in the community to have these kind of conversations about having equity across all buildings, like air conditioning, building a new building, all the things we'd like to see the district we can now do because of what you guys did, right? You guys gave us the resource and trust us with the resource to do these things. So I can tell you the board does not take any of this lightly. Nobody wants to have trailers, right? And we absolutely look at this as a temporary measure until we can get the new building built and we can sit down and have a conversation with the community about what boundaries are, what they should be. And as Kane said, it's not something we want to do every couple of years, right? Hopefully we don't do it again for a long time, maybe never, but I certainly wouldn't ascribe to that theory. But certainly, the really important part for us is to make this a collaborative process, right? Nobody wants to lay down, here's what we're doing, and that's it. No, we want to hear your opinions. You guys are there with the kids every day in the buildings, and it's really important for us to understand the impacts of all this, and that's really what we're about, is trying to make sure that you have the information to help us, make informed decisions. So
I'll piggyback on that, and we'll get back to questions. The one thing I would say that the reason we're in a much more enviable position than other districts is we know this is a temporary solution, and we simply looked at the numbers and we were looking at the difference between having potentially 30-seat classrooms or having this temporary solution, where many of us have been in districts with these, and we're actually able to, one, make it temporary, truly temporary, and two, put it in a much more secure location than where it typically is. And we felt it was worth that decision to keep the class sizes as reasonable as we can for those years before we move, and also because then when we have that conversation, redistricting is a challenging conversation. And so to be able to say, not have the conversation be about this school does or doesn't have X, Y, or Z, but have, it's still going to be emotional, but at least have it on an equal footing makes for probably a better process when we get to it to talk about the boundaries. So I know we have other questions. Yes, ma'am.
Just real quick on the timeline. When May Whitney opens, the redistricting will be in effect then, so it'll be done in the new May.
That's the goal, yes.
Okay, and then just real quick, the second question. Is referendum money being used for the mobiles, or where would that come from?
We do have enough in reserves and operating to be able to do this on a temporary basis. So it's not referendum money. That was a specific promise we asked that. Those are the only things that money's being used for.
Two questions, kind of, they go together. It's about security of the modules. So you said that they could be made of like permanent type material. Are these going to be wood? You said obviously they're not going to be brick, aluminum. What are they going to be made out of?
The frame on the inside is wood and drywall and insulation, and then typically it's like a sided house.
Okay.
Right. So.
And then you said it's going to have a gate, a fence with a gate. So I'm thinking, I come from a background that makes me think about this stuff. And I've had a lot of active shooter training, unfortunately, but fortunately we need it. So what if there was like an active shooter in the building and those kids are now stuck in this courtyard? Is there going to be a gate that someone's going to have access to lift so they can get out and not have to come back through the school? There is, okay.
Some of these things get proceduralized, right? But yeah, the goal is that gate is secure and we have protocols and access for staff and protocols that go with it in active shooter situations, other emergency situations as fire, right?
Right.
Things like that. So those would all be proceduralized before people walk out of here at the end of the school year.
And if there was something like a tornado or something coming, there'd be procedures to get those kids in the school way in advance.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, 100%. That's exactly right. And we work with our police and our fire, and actually we have a security consultant, and we work with them also.
Do the security consultants, do they come from law enforcement backgrounds?
I'm not sure if Paul does, but he works with law enforcement. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and we work closely all the time with Chief Husak and LCPD, and with, I'm forgetting the chief's last name right now.
No.
Paul? Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah. Paulus at Buffalo.
Thanks.
You had your hand up.
Yeah, can you just confirm that District 95 is staying intact and we're not, so it's just reboundary within the district?
Yes, 100%. What you're talking about, like, not even, yeah.
Just for avoidance
Yeah.
of doubt,
Yeah,
make sure.
no, I just want to make sure I get over anyone over here who they're giving up for a question.
They're all.
Yeah.
Oh, there was something.
So like, just what she asked, like we live in unincorporated Lake Surf and Forest Lake, and the new housing out in the woods that are really a block away from us are not here, they're going to Stevenson. They're not going to be able to annex us in, we are a secure part of.
Yes, there's one, been no conversation about it. Two,
That's not happening.
that's, yeah, I can tell you from having been, yeah, one, it hasn't come out. Two, it's such a, yeah, I couldn't even tell you the odds, the statistical odds of that ever happening. You would hear about it so far in advance, you would have something to say about it. But no, that's absolutely not part of it. It's gonna,
The modulars, they will be air conditioned.
yes, 100%.
And he did?
Yes, and. Yeah, no, I know. Well, and, you know, the other thing I just want to say about that, I think I put it on here, heated, cooled, ventilated, and not out in the sun. In the sense of, they will to a degree, but they're in the courtyard. So actually, to that degree, you'll see some places where they're baking in the sun all day. These won't, because the courtyard will provide some basic shade for them. Yes, ma'am. Okay, sir.
Can you look at some numbers just for a second? If Spencer Loomis was built for approximately 550 kids, and we are currently at, what, 600 and... It was below 600.
We're at like 560, 565, I believe.
Okay, so are we feeling secure in the numbers coming in? Because you're talking not this year, and next year, and then the following year, and maybe a third year. Are we sure that if we're bringing in the 4 classrooms, is that going to be enough to keep us under the 550 capacity for Spencer Loomis? Or, if we...
Well,
do you see what I'm saying?
yeah,
If the
no,
capacity
we.
for this building is 550.
Uh-huh.
I mean, my understanding is that's roughly
I
that's
don't-
what it's built for, right? 550.
Okay, I'd have to look at what it's
Okay,
built
so,
for, yeah.
and then, and you want to put 100 kids out,
I don't know that 100 kids will go out there, yeah.
But numbers wise,
Uh-huh.
are we getting 2 years down the road and we're to capacity in both,
Both
the out and the in?
and the in. That's possible. We don't see the numbers jumping that much. The issue for us is that because these limits are at the upper limit, I can just add 5 kids, and I've got a 32 section, a 32 seat class, right? So I don't anticipate necessarily adding 100 more kids, but if I add 30 more kids in the right grades, I might need 4 sections, right? So my building won't have capacity issues in terms of the number of students, but it would have a capacity issue in terms of the number of rooms where I could teach those students. That's our big concern. That's what we see as the big concern.
What, on that, are we trying to keep classes at 25, under 30?
The
What is
guidelines
it?
for 2nd through 5th are 27, 23 for kindergarten. And so, as I said, they go up and down, but they're always at the upper limit of all ours, and some of them, particularly that 2nd grade.
What's the purple, what's the non-Spencer Loomis one that's jumping? Who's
I
that?
don't remember on the top of my head. Isaac Fox has gone up, it might be Isaac Fox, but I don't know. So this is near the top. This is not as much near the top, but it's at the top of all the others. Top, and again, at the top of all the others. It's a marginal issue. So in other words, I add 4 kids, and I need a whole nother class, right? Now that brings your class size down, which is good. But if I don't do that, I have a class of 31 potentially, or 2 classes of 29. And so that's not where we want to live, especially since we've already been near the upper end of our limit. And because we don't know for sure, this is what we would call a hedge against that being an issue.
So what are the growth projections? You've mentioned growth projections a couple of times.
Right.
If you have numbers, you can actually show.
So I could show you a demographic report, and it'll tell you, who's read a demographic report before? So they'll tell you 3 things with a lot of confidence. Those are that your population will go down, it will stay the same, or it will go up. And they won't tell you which one. So we have a demographic that says that.
No, I get that, but you were talking about
How
how
much
much they have.
Yeah, so we anticipate.
But all the new construction you were mentioning,
Yeah.
staff and community leaders,
Yeah.
and all the expectations over the next 2 years, what are those numbers coming?
So literally in the district, hundreds, close to 200 new single-family housing units. The majority of them in this boundary area. Right. And so at the rate that those go in, at the rate they uptake families, that's our concern ultimately. With putting that together with what we've seen the numbers doing here already. Right. So
how many new students do you expect that to generate in this?
I'd have to go back and look, but I don't know the number off the top of my head. You know, it's not like 1 per, right? But
Well, because that goes back to the question, is are you looking far enough ahead to understand whether or not capacity we're looking to add here is sufficient to absorb what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years based upon the need.
we think for the next 2 to 3 years, yes. Now the challenge is, like when I look at that demographic report, if I look at the upper range that it produces, we think the district will have capacity for that upper range. When you redistrict, the school doesn't have capacity for that upper range. But in the next 2 years, it can handle it if we have this safety valve. Anybody else over here? Yes, sir, you had your hand up. I feel like I'm calling. Sorry, but
The grounds surrounding the modular space, are there any plans to make that recreational?
What would you mean by recreational?
Like out at recess?
No.
No, okay.
No.
Then there's 30 feet in between the 2 buildings.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm just trying to picture a child that's got to go to the bathroom, you know, it's 10 degrees outside, he's got to bundle up and walk through there. Are there any plans to put some kind of canopy or maybe an enclosed see-through tunnel?
We'll talk about that. That might be a structural issue too. We're also going to be visiting schools that have different permutations and kind of see what's been working or not working for them. So we do know, I've been in, this will sound like I'm responsible for it, I'm not. I've been in 4 districts that have had mobiles at different stages in their life. You know, like a place where they had to build one new, and then I was at a place that had them for 20 years, and we took them down, right? And in that same district, they had them for 20 years, and we're keeping them. You know, what I want to emphasize, though, is we have a shelf life. You know, I'm just telling you right now, I don't want them forever. I have no intention to have them forever. We have a plan that is unlike other districts where they don't have the plan, they don't have a referendum that's going to deal with capacity issues and space issues. They're putting them out there hoping that either the numbers go down or the money shows up to go build something. And so we're not in that situation.
Just curious, thinking through capacity and the like a student-teacher ratio, and obviously knowing that this is an incline, have we looked at any insight or data to correlate student performance tied to capacity? So I think of these classrooms with higher capacity. Do we see on those trend lines any impact to student performance?
I don't believe we do. I have not seen any. I have not seen any for this district. I can tell you what the research says, is that typically, frankly, there's not a lot of correlation. There is sometimes with one younger kid and two with kids who come from under-resourced communities where they're not getting certain kinds of support at home. And so we do have to be watchful of that. But we have no data that suggests our student achievement is suffering as a result of this. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean we want to push the envelope, indefinitely with that. Okay.
So I guess mine's not really a question, I'm just kind of summarizing, because I think that maybe there is a fear or reality in that we're getting these modular classrooms, or if we get them, class sizes could still go up at this school, just depending on how quickly houses are built and how fast people move into those houses and what age their kids are, right? That is a potential reality. But that's what we're trying to avoid, is them getting too big.
Correct, 100%. Yeah, we don't want to roll the dice and hope that doesn't happen in the next 2 years.
Right.
And we want to plan for the longer term and be in a good position for a conversation planning for implementing that longer term. I would be, to your point, I think you brought it earlier, I mean, I could say we're going to build 6 out there, but at some point I have to give what our best estimate is, and this is what we think it is. So, okay, yes ma'am, and then I'll come back over here, I promise.
So, because I see Sandy here, but I don't see Mr. Jackson upstairs.
I announced earlier he has a family funeral.
Okay.
Ms. Searle is here.
Okay. So potentially, if everything's on the table, these modulars could be used for middle school north, or they could be used for Spencer Lewis. And with that being said, no matter what, any child that has to be in this modular building will still have to come into this building, whether for lunch or specials. So no matter what, this is not really self-contained, whether you do specials or academic.
When we say self-contained, we mean there isn't any easy external access. Most places where you go mobiles, they're next to the building, or outside where if I drive up to the building, I can walk right to the mobiles. That's what I mean by external access. There is none of that access that exists unless you try to climb an 8-foot fence. We're going to look at what are the procedures to monitor space, generally. So, okay. Yes.
All right. So now I have a number of questions before. I had multiple, but these might be easy. So you mentioned that there were no bathrooms. So are there any sinks and or lockers in the module?
What we will look at is installing, I don't want to say temporary, but there will be hooks.
Okay.
But then we will look at how we could put like, what's the way I put it, like your California closet version, like you would put something in there to hold things.
All right. Just because my fear was if they had the lockers here and they're walking outside in the cold with our
Correct.
winters. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the things we anticipate talking about proceduralizing. Yeah.
Will you be advertising when the Hawthorne meetings will be, and will we be able to go?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I don't know the actual date yet. Do we know the first one?
The first one will either be October 9th, next Tuesday, highly unlikely, at least we haven't heard.
Yeah.
The application is in front of the Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals. Most likely it will be on October 23rd. But again, I highly recommend you go to the Hawthorne Woods website. And just a caveat, if your house is within 250 feet of our property line, you will be notified by the village of when those meetings are taking place.
Okay, got it.
So once we're notified, we'll.
Notified.
Yeah, it's all
Okay.
public. So.
No, just making sure. Okay, two more quick questions. I know you said that there's no referendum money being used for this, and you have the budget for it. But are you able to provide us with an estimate of how much these will cost?
Over the 3 years, right, because it's a lease, right, we anticipate with installation and transport less than $500,000, but somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000.
Total, or per year?
Total.
Total, okay.
Yeah,
And then, sorry, one more last question. I know we're talking about redistricting and that coming in 2021, but what's the thought process as far as when you'll be kind of rolling that out to us? Or
That's 2019-20, so the year before.
So then we'll be able to see the map and say, okay, this is what's,
100%,
okay.
yeah. And actually, not the spring before, but the fall before, right? And so a full year before we do it, we would go through a process only in the fall. Because you have to get it done by the fall to start replanting.
Well, and I imagine you guys have already started looking at that, but that's not something that we're privy to yet?
I'll be honest, we're not sitting with a map in our office like, oh, let's move the lines. I'm just going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you why, because one, you'd always like as much information as you can possibly get, okay? Two, my method tends to, I will bring drafts of what our computer program that we'll work with will produce, but I don't believe it's productive to do it and then wring my hands for 2 years and say, okay, what are we going to do? Because I know I'm going to go through a process where I'm going to sit with all of you and go through it. So somebody actually emailed me and said, what neighborhoods are you moving? I can tell you without a doubt, I have not put a pin on a map that has said this is or that's moving. And the reason is because anybody who tells you, one, that there's a perfect district map is lying. Okay, doesn't exist. And two, anybody who tells you they have a crystal ball and know how to look into the future and tell you what it should look like all by themselves, they're also selling you something. So we will bring you the best information we have that we think, but we will have a conversation about it, okay, and talk about what it means. And it won't be just one where we say, I know for some folks, I understand we're coming to you and saying we're doing this, but this is a pretty limited scope, and there's very few real options available that we think are reasonable for all kids for the interim. If this were a long-term issue, it'd be a different conversation. Maps are a long-term issue, so they require a full engagement. Yes, ma'am.
Will there be cameras, on the fence?
Not
on the fence. But
yeah,
we
will be talking about that. We're going to visit schools that have them and don't, so we would anticipate that being an option. We just have to make sure how it's going to work.
Okay, right? And second part of my question, the kids that are out in these modulars, are they going to get all of the announcements like the rest of school? Because I know that the classrooms on the MSN side, they don't really hear everything, so.
They'll be fully wired for sound.
Okay.
So
they'll be still included in the school.
And I could speak to that. We do announcements in the morning to upload Spencer Loomis proper here, but then we do call into individual classrooms and do the same announcements, so we are privy to that because it's from the side.
Okay.
Just for information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, we fully anticipate full connectivity. So.
Are the mobile classrooms going to be built to spec, or are we buying these sort of second-hand or used, or what are the options?
It depends. We have to talk to the vendor about the best option. We wouldn't get something too used, but we would just look and see what's available, and the price, and our needs, right? I don't think built to spec is really one that's on the table necessarily.
Yeah, we're looking at floor plans that are pre-existing, meaning whether it's new or used, they're already predetermined. But just so that you understand the construction process, they are built to typical building codes of what you would find even in your homes today. So the type of wall construction, the R value of the roof, the floor, the walls, it often exceeds a lot of commercial type buildings. We're very pleased with the information that we received regarding the construction.
Will there be sprinklers in the building? Will there be sprinklers, like fire sprinklers?
We are not required to sprinkle the building because it's under 7,500 square feet. So no.
So then, you're saying they would be built to the same specs as home building code, but not the same specs as the school, the main building?
Again, this building was constructed with block and masonry construction with steel I-beams. That is not the specification of this building.
They will have to be inspected by the Regional Office of Education and meet standards that are required by them, which is really required by the state of Illinois.
Are there any studies available that the impact of academics or social to children who are in trailer environment?
And I don't know, I'll find out. So, not that we know of, but we can look it up. I mean, we'll see if we can find something.
And then, kind of off that, are we engaging with other school districts that have trailer environments and learning?
Yes, I met with Brian Harris, the superintendent of 220 this morning for that exact thing. And I've been in, like I said, 3 districts that have had them in various stages of use. So I was in Naperville 203, and they actually had schools in different phases. They had schools that were no longer using them, took them down. They had a school where they had their middle school gifted program for the whole district in the trailers at Kennedy Junior High School. I was there regularly. And we talked about that all the time. So procedures, protocols, expectations, communication. And then I've been at a place when I was in District 219 where during construction, actually, they built these because the construction was impinging on the building, and they were very temporary when the construction was over. These left.
Are you going to be able to consolidate that learning and bring it back to us and say, here's the key things that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so two stuff. Absolutely. So one, we'll try to have some of these in FAQs, but when we get to the conversation in December, you know, we'll have as much information as we can. I don't want to foreclose the process part of that, but we would want to have that information. So when we talk about criteria, we know what research says as much as we can about these criteria, but we anticipate, you know, there could be other criteria that you and the staff come up with that we haven't generated. And so then we'd have to go back and get more information.
And once the criteria is actually created and it's finalized, are we also going to see the kind of the prioritization of that criteria so we know what's kind of highest priority, lowest priority?
Yeah, I would anticipate we talk about that a little bit here. You know, it'll be a little fuzzy because we wouldn't have documented it in the final language, but we would anticipate what's the most important thing that we anticipate. You know, we always say the most important thing is safety and health of our students. People say, oh, it's academics. Well, no, actually, you send us your kids every day and you want to know that they're safe. Then we'll worry about the academics. But we'll talk about priorities. Then what we would anticipate is between this time and this time, we would share back with you what those priorities are. And then before we do this, what I do is I take those criteria and I say to the principals first, because they know these buildings better than anybody, okay, you go out and give me scenarios that you think meet these criteria, and then we sit down, we talk about them, we look at them, we analyze them, and then we determine what's the best decision that matches those criteria as well as possible.
Do you roughly know what grades are at capacity that you're seeing they need the extra space? Like you have a second grader who has to leave the mobile unit to go to the office or the nursery, the restroom. That's kind of little, they could get lost and wanted space between, someone should probably go with them, but if you have a seventh grader, they're little cockers, they might take their time.
Right. We anticipate that coming up in our conversation. Like when we say, here are the criteria, and then we say, okay, what would it look like if seventh graders met this criteria? Would they meet it better than second graders? And I mean meet it, it's not like a test for them, but which works better? So we would absolutely be trying to answer those in the context of which students together. The other thing I want to emphasize, though, is it's not like we're building these and then saying, okay, whichever class is the most overcrowded, they go out there. That's not, what it works is, we identify which best meets the criteria, right, that can meet all these criteria and our goals for having space. We implement that, and then the anticipation, of course, is we empty out space for which we would use additional sections, right? When you ask which grade is, I got to tell you, if you see the lines, it goes like this. Yes.
I have a couple questions. So are those external doors on the trailers also going to be locked?
We'll have a security procedure for that. Yeah, we have to talk about that. It's more likely that what would happen is the doors to the classrooms in the hallways, like the doors here, would be locked. We'd have to talk about locking them and procedures, again, the age of the students who are going out there, you know, how often are students going out there, we'd have to talk about that or not. Because right now, what we tell teachers is your classroom door should be locked, right? So we'd have to talk about what that would look like.
And then the second part then, so if someone does need to come over, would they always be escorted, no matter what?
You mean like an adult?
No, maybe like a kid.
Oh, we don't know yet. It depends. We have to go through the criteria and talk about which kids are we, you know. We'd have a different conversation if we're talking about third graders versus talking about seventh graders, right? So.
So you mentioned that you're going to lease, but the walls are basically standard construction. So what part is leased, I guess, is the question, because, you know, you have construction, demolition, but then what are you getting from this company?
I don't know about demolition. You still move them. You would put them up. They're modular, so you would still take the pieces up and move them, right? So it's not demolition. So, you know, the one thing about the difference, and there's a district, I can't remember who was telling me this, about buying them. If we buy them, okay, first of all, it would make no sense to buy something like this for 3 years. But the districts that do, then they're stuck with them. And one district couldn't get anybody to take it away. They buried it. And so, you know, we're not in that boat, but part of the lease agreement, you know, strangely enough, the higher costs on margin are about the bringing it in and setting it up and taking it away than they are about the actual, like, building of it. So.
First, thank you. You have the entire team together from the school board, CFO, principals, or so. In the next meeting that we're together, would you consider having somebody that stood in your shoes, such as the superintendent, the neighboring superintendent that implemented it and could weigh in his experiences or her experiences?
I don't know that I'd have them come to the meeting, but I could talk to them about maybe sharing some comments or video or something about their experience. I can do that for sure.
He's actually at my house. I was going to bring him, but I
Thank you. I don't know him. I'm sure he's wonderful. But
he actually implemented them into district. So genuinely, if anybody has questions to work on, I would be happy to pass them along.
But certainly, like I said, I mean, I've been with them in Naperville, I've been with them in Niles, and I talked to Brian Harris, who is one of my close colleagues on a regular basis. And he's given me some things that I anticipate bringing to this meeting in December as options. I just don't want to get in the weeds too much.
I don't know if this is negligible or too much in the weeds, but will there be some sort of a study or report based on like the time that it takes for these kids, to, especially here where we're in cold weather, to put their coat, you know, I have to go to the bathroom, put my coat on, put my boots on. You know, maybe a kid does that 3 times a day. Then plus coming in, they forget something in their locker, they have to come back for lunch, are constantly coats on, boots on. I mean, how much time over the span of a year, 2 years, 3 years are these kids losing in terms of learning versus the kids who get to stay in the main building?
So one, it's unlikely to be the same kids every year, right?
That's good.
I don't want to, I'm not promising anything, I'm just saying that's unlikely. 2, when we go visit other districts, we'll talk to them about that and see what their experience is. I've heard various things, but I think it just depends on the situation. We'll try to give, that would be pretty qualitative or even anecdotal data, but we'll try to bring back what we can from the districts we visit to see what are their teachers saying about that part of it. You know, I will tell you, this is, I know it's not necessarily believable, but it is something I hear again and again, is one, some teachers prefer to be there because you're in a different traffic and kind of pattern, and they like, you know, we're contained, right? We're here and we're not in the midst of things sometimes. And in some cases, I don't think that's the case here. In some districts, the mobile classrooms are nicer than the regular classrooms because they're actually literally newer. I mean, technically, these classrooms will be newer than the classrooms we have inside, right? So I'm not saying that as a selling point, but that is something that that teachers who have been in them say. I will tell you also, the opposite can be true. You know, there have been teachers who have been put in ones that are 25 years old, and they're not kept up and they're not good, but we are not going to be putting those in our courtyard.
Question on the term of the lease. So you have a 3-year lease right now. Construction usually goes longer, we understand that, but if it doesn't and things go on plan, what's the option for that second or third year? Does that money go back in reserves? Is the lease just sunk cost at that point? What is it?
It would probably just be cost. We're talking, we have talked about, I know at Facilities Committee, we talked about doing a 2-year with an option for a third. So we're going to see what that cost is. Typically, they won't give you a better, you'll pay more for that option. But we're going to look at that, and that's something we would bring to the board ultimately that's a contract financial decision the board would have to make, because we go through the ins and outs of that. Yes, ma'am, you get your name.
Any possibility that there could be a guard that would be stationed at the gate, or sort of a new position created?
We will look at that. We will look at personnel options. When we look at talking about back and forth and visual accessibility, we will look at technology, people, whatever. We'll look at all the options that are available. So we will not rule that out.
Would you also be looking at temporary sidewalks?
Yes, we would. We have to. ADA accessibility. We have to do that. Okay, so those were great questions. Those were very good questions, and those are questions that we anticipate and intend to fully give full detailed answers to when we come to the point, in the future in the process. So, what to look for next. We will send out FAQs this month based on yours. So if you wrote something down and could just leave it, we'll pick it up. But we'll also have the video to review, and we'll use that. Take those FAQs, send them out to everybody. If when you get those, you're like, oh, you missed this, or you didn't answer this, or that's not what I meant, just email us back and say this is what I meant, and we'll seek to answer it and clarify. The village hearings, we're waiting to hear if it's October 9th or the 23rd. We will send that information out too. It'll also be posted on their website. We just haven't heard back yet. We've submitted the application. We'll update the board in November and December. We will set a meeting for early December. Honestly, it could be late November. We just have to sit down with a calendar and pick the best date. We'll talk to the PTO to make sure, we're not in other conflicts. There's always a lot going on. And then that's when we would come to you with kind of a full structured engagement process where we would come up with some very general starting criteria and say, what do these mean to you? What are your questions? And then what are we missing? And then we take all of those and we try to refine them into basically a document that says, this is what we've said now are the criteria we have to implement to do this successfully. Send that back out to you, and then I ask the principals to say, okay, what's going to make what scenario will make this most successful based on these criteria? And we would finalize those in the spring, and then we'd update you in the spring at the same time. Actually, we'd update you before this and after this. And then we would install in the late spring, really early summer, and the ROE would inspect it upon installation. And the goal is that families would walk out of here and staff would walk out of here knowing who's going to be there, what the procedures are. We'd give them the preliminaries, and then of course when you come back right at the beginning, we would go through some pretty rigorous training, practice of protocols and procedures to make sure that everybody was on the right page with that. And that's the process. So thank you for your good questions. I understand that this can be a very challenging issue. We take it very seriously, and at each of these steps, I really hope you can come back and keep asking these questions and keep driving these questions forward, because I do truly believe that that's what will make this the best it can be in this short term until we get to our long-term solution. So thanks.
Are you going to post the presentations?
Yeah, we will actually, and the video, so they'll go together. And as soon as he's got the audio and them matched up, we'll have it posted, and we'll be sending out an email with the link to that.
Folks, thank you all for coming in. It really means a lot to us to hear what you have to say. I think, on the interesting good news part of all this is, people want to move to our community, right? So we're growing, which is a great thing, and its own detriments, of course. And I'll tell you that when we talk to the real estate agents, we talk to the mayors, people come to our community principally for District 95, right? that's the draw. People usually want to come here. So, you know, we see this, obviously, the district is a very valuable resource. It's probably the most valuable resource communities have. So we take it very seriously when you entrust upon us the desire to take good care of it, keep it moving forward. And we don't take the decision lightly to put trailers into our district. It's not our first choice. We definitely see it as a temporary measure. And, you know, again, we're very thankful to have the resource, to have a plan to move forward, to have them just as temporary. But I really want to thank you all for coming out tonight, especially on a Cubs playoff game night. But it's really important to hear what you have to say. And again, we take all your comments very seriously. And certainly take them into consideration when we make these decisions. We want to make you, again, part of the decision process. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, everybody. If you leave your cards on your chair, we'll pick them up.